திரும்ப நான் போட முடியாதுல்ல மேம். 2 கிருஷ்ணவேணியையும் கோஹோஸ்டா போடுங்க. மேம் நானே பண்றேன். இப்ப என்ன கோஹோஸ்டா மாத்திட்டாங்களே. 71 வந்துட்டாங்க. நானே குடுக்காம வச்சிருக்கேன். குடிச்சிங்களா நீங்களே? வருதா? கிரீன் கலர் ஐடி அது வந்து போகுதுப்பா. ஆமா சார் கிரீன் தான். அது டச் பண்ணோனே வேற எங்கேயோ போகுதா? சாட் தான் வருது.
ஸ்கிரீன் ஷேர் போக மாட்டேங்குது.
வந்துட்டாங்க. இங்க காமிக்கிறாங்க. காமிக்கலையா?
All the 3 activities are lined up in your textbook. Please read once. Okay, so that you will understand. Yes, ready for the next session. Your doubts you can ask for ma'am next class. Okay.
ஹலோ மேம். அவங்க அன்மியூட்ல இருக்காங்க. அபினியா மேம். அபினியா மேம் அபினியா மேம் நம்ம தான் அவங்க அன்மியூட் பண்ண சொல்லுங்க. அன்மியூட் பண்ண அன்மியூட்ல இருக்கா? மேம் ஹலோ மேம். ஹலோ அபினியா மேம். எல்லாமே கேக்குது. எல்லாருமே அன்மியூட்டா தான் இருக்கணும். நம்ம ஒரு இதுல தான் இருக்கணும். மேம் shall we start? இதுலதான் போட்டா கரெக்டா சொல்றாங்க.
உங்க பேசுறது கேட்க ஹலோ மேம் நான் ஸ்டார்ட் பண்ணலாம்.
அனுஷியா நீங்க இருந்துங்க டக்குன்னு ஆரம்பிக்கும் போது எனக்கு வீடியோ
ஸ்டார்ட் பண்ணிக்கலாம். அட்மிட் கொடுக்க போறேன் மேம். ஹலோ ஹலோ ஹலோ.
Yes, ma'am. Shall we start?
Can we yes, we can. Okay.
Good morning, dear participants. It is not just about ideas. It is about making ideas happen to do it. We, the Department of English of Don Bosco College of Arts and Science, Kilairal, invite you for this webinar, a lockdown initiative. Before starting, I must acknowledge the unwavering support received from the faculty members, academicians, research scholars, and students. Thank you so much for the support. Before starting, let me remind you few webinar etiquettes. Please mute your audio and video. If you have queries, kindly text in the chat box. Reply will be given by the resource person at the end of the session. Feedback form will be displayed only in Zoom chat box and YouTube live chat. To further illustrate, I would cordially invite Professor Abhinaya to welcome the invitees and attendees. Over to Abhinaya, ma'am.
A very good morning to all the participants. We welcome you all to today's webinar on cultural studies apropos Antonio Gramsci. The Sun and I are pleased to offer you all a warm welcome. On behalf of our reputed institution, we invoke the Almighty to make His presence throughout this session. With immense pleasure, I roll upon the red carpet to welcome our respected Secretary of our college, Reverend Dr. Amala Jayarayan. We are delighted to offer the most hospitable welcome to you, Father. It's my pleasure to extend a cheerful welcome to the principal of our college, Dr. S. Pius Messier, who supports us to attain higher level. We delightfully welcome you, Sir Sandhu, Dean of our college, who is a diligent supporter of each and every step towards our development. Welcome you, Father. Next, I'll offer a warm welcome to Father Charles, Administrator, and Father Jude Muthaselvam, Vice Structure, who has been consistently supported in all our Next, I'm extremely happy to welcome our head as well as today's speaker, Dr. J. Raga Antony, Associate Professor, Department of English, Don Bosco College of Arts and Science, Kilera, who has been the source of encouragement and awaiting to nail this session. Welcome you, sir. Next, I'd like to extend my cheerful welcome to all the research scholars, faculty, and student participants of the institution, and also from various institutions across the state. I welcome you all back with my hopes and aspirations for all that is possible in the days ahead. Thank you. Hello, ma'am. Hello. Hello, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. Now, I would like to call upon our respected principal, Dr. Pius Messier, to felicitate the gathering. Over to you, sir.
Good morning. Dear Reverend Father Amala Jayarayan,
I would like to call upon our respected principal,
respected Reverend Father Amala Jayarayan, Secretary of our college, Reverend Father Divya Alex Dean, Reverend Father Charles Anthony, the Administrator, respected Chief Guest and Resource Person of this national webinar, Professor Dr. J. Raghantani, Head and Associate Professor, Department of English, Don Bosco College of Arts and Science, Kelayaral. Dear participants, a very good morning to all. We extend a warm welcome to all this national webinar on cultural studies organized by the PG and Research Department of English, Don Bosco College of Arts and Science. With immense joy and grateful to God Almighty, I deem it an honor to offer my presidential address to this national webinar. Our Don Bosco educational institutions serving the society throughout the world and widely renowned for quality education that combines knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes and prepare the youth, especially the poor, a successful career and a meaningful life. Our college is managed and owned by Salesians of Don Bosco Trichy province. In our midst, Professor Dr. J. Raghantani, the resource person of this webinar. I am very happy to introduce him to you all. He has a rich experience of more than 30 years of teaching. He is an approved guide of Madurai Manommaniya Sundarrao University and he is guiding 6 PhD scholars. He has successfully guided more than 25 MPhil scholars. He has published more than 50 articles in renowned national and international journals. He has attended more than 50 seminars and conferences. He has translated 6 books to his credit. He is a member of the Board of Studies of various colleges and universities. So with this brief introduction, I am very happy to introduce Professor Dr. J. Raghantani. I wish to express my sincere thanks for accepting this seminar to deliver a talk on this seminar. So in this juncture, I wish to express my sincere thanks to the faculties of the Department of English of our college and also to express our sincere thanks to especially Reverend Father Secretary, Reverend Father Dean, and Reverend Father Administrator for their cooperations and guidance extended. So all the best. Thank you, one and all. God bless you.
Thank you, sir. Now, I would like to invite our Dean, Reverend Father Divya Alexander, to introduce the webinar. Over to Father.
Good morning to you all, dear participants. Now to begin with, I am here to give an idea about today's webinar. Today's webinar entitled Cultural Studies Apropos Antonio Gramsci introduces you to Gramsci's idea of culture, which is a powerful force in a capital society. The Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci developed the concept of cultural hegemony out of Karl Marx's theory. Usually, we associate cultural studies with media, art, painting, dance, family, philosophy, whereas Gramsci's idea of culture needs to be constituted and paid attention to everyday living with utmost importance to various societal foundations. First of all, we need to be informed and get to know how does a culture impact people. Of course, cultural impact is made through shared values, do's and don'ts, inclusive and exclusive aspects. Cultural studies mean what is right and what is not right, what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. Gone are the days when monoculture dominated the society and made strong influence in the realm of superstructural society. Moving towards multicultural society, where we articulate the connections between culture, the state, the economy, and power relations. Therefore, a cultural study is not having claim over purity of race, purity of language, purity of caste, and ethnic group. Cultural study makes us realize, provides space to everyone, more flexible, highly accommodative, accepting the differences. It embraces all, irrespective of caste, race, religion, culture with enriched values. With this introduction, I wish you all the best and have a new insight in the theory of Gramsci's cultural studies.
நீ பேசுனதே கேட்கல ஏன்னா அது
Thank you, Father. I am a pessimist by my observations, but an optimist in my actions, says Gramsci. It gives me immense pleasure to call upon our head of the department, come eminent speaker, Dr. J. Raghu Anthony, to throw some light on the topic, Cultural Studies Apropos, Antonio Gramsci. Over to you, sir.
Cultural Studies apropos Antonio Gramsci. Cultural studies is a branch of knowledge that became popular in Great Britain in the 1960s and it continues to be so even today. There was a small technical glitch. Now we resume. Cultural studies is a multidisciplinary branch of knowledge that began in the 1960s in Great Britain, and it continues to be in currency even today. Cultural studies encompasses various disciplines such as literature, politics, sociology, anthropology, history, media studies, ethnography, and much more. Therefore, there is a tendency to call cultural studies as antidisciplinary because it does not come under any one particular discipline. Now, when did cultural studies begin? Cultural studies, by this term, that is calling itself cultural studies, was started by Raymond Williams. Raymond Williams was a British Marxist academician and literary critic. His famous books are Culture and Society, written in 1958, Culture and Materialism, written in 1900. And the key essay that he wrote with regard to cultural studies is an essay titled Culture is Ordinary, written in 1958. In this essay, Raymond Williams says that culture is not elitist, because usually we tend to associate culture with the upper class, as if it is an elitist attitude and behavior. But Raymond Williams said that culture is not elitist, culture is ordinary. That is, culture is everyday lived experience. Culture is not individualistic. You cannot attribute culture to any one individual. Rather, culture is shared. It is shared values and aspirations of a society or a group put together. Now, we need to go back a little and see how culture was looked upon a little earlier. During the Victorian period, we had a very famous literary critic called Matthew Arnold, and his famous books too, Culture and Anarchy, written in 1869, and Literature and Dogma, 1873. And next, in the beginning of the 20th century, we had a very influential critic, as you know, T.S. Eliot, a great formalist. And he also talked about culture. His famous books are Notes Towards a Definition of Culture, written in 1948, and Literature and Religion, written in 1958. Following these two critics and influenced by their writings, we had the famous Cambridge critic, F.R. Lewis. He wrote a famous book, English Literature in Our Time and the University, in 1969, and another book, The Living Principle, in 1975. Now, these three critics put together are called cultural critics. Now, how did these three writers look at culture? For these three writers, culture is something highbrow, elitist, which is confined to a small upper class educated group. And this small upper class elitist group is entrusted with the job of maintaining culture. And Matthew Arnold, T.S. Eliot, and F.R. Lewis considered the working class, what Marx would call the proletariat, as the vulgar masses, that is the low class, the working class. And Matthew Arnold called them Philistines. Philistines are supposed to be the large group of people who had low, bad, or no values. And F.R. Lewis and T.S. Eliot said that it was the responsibility of the elite, the upper class, to uphold social values and save society from all that threatens the social order. Now, Stuart Hall, the next important cultural critic, was influenced by Raymond Williams. And Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall together attacked Matthew Arnold, T.S. Eliot, and F.R. Lewis. For Raymond Williams as well as Stuart Hall, culture is something ordinary. Culture belongs to the everyday life, and culture is shared. Now, Stuart Hall was a Jamaican-born British academician. He is a very important Marxist literary theorist, and he wrote two famous books, The Popular Arts in 1964 and The Questions of Cultural Identity in 1966. And his very important theory is encoding and decoding of communication. And he wrote an article titled The Encoding/Decoding Model of Communication. That is, he says, any work of art, whether it is highbrow or lowbrow, whether it belongs to the working class or whether it belongs to the masses, is always mediated by culture. And any work of art is the product of the common culture. Now, how did Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall look at culture? First, both argued that culture does not consist of what the educated elites happen to favor, such as classical music or the fine arts. Even in India, you have the classical music, classical dance, and the classical art forms, which are held by the upper class, the elites. And in the West also, you have Bach, Beethoven, and the operas, which are considered to be elitist. And Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall said that this is not culture, this is something else, that is politics. We'll come to that a little later, how it is politics. Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall said that culture is simply experience that is lived, experience that is interpreted, experience that is defined. And culture embodies an unconscious sense of the values we share. That is very, very important. We includes the masses. We does not exclude anybody. We does not exclude the ordinary people. It puts together. It is inclusive. And culture gives us a sense of what is right or what is wrong, what is socially acceptable and what is socially not acceptable or inappropriate. Now, a key issue in cultural studies is the examination of the forces within and through which socially organized people, when we say socially organized people, we mean people with something in common, that is socially organized people, how they conduct themselves and participate in the construction of their everyday lives. That is very important, because in elite culture, art is not everyday life. It is divested, it is divorced from everyday life. It has got nothing to do with everyday life. Classical music or classical dance or classical art form is not a part of everyday life. That is elitist. But in cultural studies, according to Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall, it is everyday living. And more importantly, culture is not concerned with the uncategorized experiences of individuals. So individuals are not important. Individual experiences, subjective experiences are not important. They simply do not exist. And all experiences are tempered and mediated by particular social and political context. This is very, very important. This is much closer to structuralism. This is something what Stanley Fish calls as interpretative communities in his famous essay, Is There a Text in the Class? Stanley Fish initiated the reader response theory, and many are misled by the title, that is there a text in the class? And then they say the reader response, all of us respond to a text in our own way. That is a subjective response to a text. A text. That is not the meaning. What Stanley Fish meant was no individual responds to a text as an individual. There is no subjective response to a text. We always respond to a text based on our past common experience. A lady who is reading a text would respond to the text as a woman, not as an individual. A Dalit reading a text would respond to the text based on his or her Dalit experience. Or a black reading Othello would look at Othello from a black perspective. So they have shared experiences, and these shared experiences are used to interpret the text, and these people are called interpretative communities. So that is what Stanley Fish meant. And interpretative communities are fundamentally culturally conditioned. So we respond to a text based on our cultural experience, based on our collective experience. Now, we saw that cultural studies began in Great Britain in the 1960s, and it continues to be in currency. But in fact, cultural studies had a much earlier beginning. Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist, began the concept of cultural studies. Antonio Gramsci was an Italian Marxist. He led the Italian Communist Party after the First World War in Italy. Now, after the First World War, Antonio Gramsci saw that all the conditions that Marx predicted for a revolution of the proletariat were in place. The conditions for a revolution were ready, in place, appropriate, and everybody predicted the proletariat revolution would happen very soon. But the revolution did not happen. Instead, Mussolini and his fascist party took over, and Antonio Gramsci was imprisoned. While being incarcerated in prison, Gramsci began to reconsider the theory of Marx. He asked the question, all the conditions predicted by Marx for a revolution were in place in Italy. But then, why didn't the revolution happen? And Antonio Gramsci found that though the conditions for a revolution were there was something else that was mediating between the proletariat and the revolution. Something was hindering, something was there as a stumbling block for the revolution of the proletariat. And he found it was a civil society. When he said civil society, he meant the cultural consciousness of the Italians, who were highly attached to their religion, that is the Catholic faith, which did not approve of a violent revolution. So the Italians were religiously coerced or convinced that a revolution was not right, was morally wrong. And this was a strong force that was preventing the revolution. And this is what Gramsci called as the cultural constraint, the cultural control over the people. And Antonio Gramsci wrote his ideas in 4 volumes called the Prison Notebooks. They were smuggled out of the prison later and they were published after the Second World War. Now, Gramsci is very famous for 3 concepts. One is hegemony or hegemony. You can pronounce it either way, hegemony or hegemony. Then the concept of the subaltern. You must be very familiar with the term subaltern. Spivak's famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? And then the third concept is organic intellectuals. Hegemony is control, but control not by force, not by violence, but through culture, through ideology. That is what Gramsci meant by hegemony. Then subaltern was actually a person who held the lowest rank in the army. He was called a subaltern. But here a subaltern means anybody who is marginalized. And third is organic intellectuals. Gramsci considered all people to be intellectuals, but divided them into 2 groups. That is status quo intellectuals and organic intellectuals. Status quo intellectuals do not question anything. They just repeat what is already said. Organic intellectuals, on the other hand, are vibrant. They challenge the status quo. They challenge power structures. And in this sense, Gramsci himself was an organic intellectual. Now, Gramsci's main concept was culture was an active force that was controlling people. He differed from the traditional Marxist idea, that is, traditional Marxism believes in economic determinism, that is, the economic or the means of production controlling the people. You have the base and the superstructure. Means of production is the base, and arts, religion, family, other social institutions form the superstructure. And no superstructure can exist defying the basic structure. That is what traditional Marxism believed in. But Gramsci said this is not an adequate explanation of exploitation of control. He said more than or as much as the economic force, culture has a very important role in justifying and perpetuating power structures. So power structures maintain themselves, justify their existence, justify their rule using culture. For example, in a family, the male authority is justified through culture, through tradition. In a classroom, a teacher's dominance or the teacher's superiority over the students is justified using tradition. You cannot question a teacher. Or it is the white man's control over the black. So culture, Gramsci said, has a very important role in controlling people and this he called as cultural hegemony. Hegemony means control. So cultural hegemony is the domination of a culturally diverse or different people by one particular class, that is the ruling class. The culture of the ruling class or the ideas of the ruling class or the interests of the ruling class becomes the ruling culture, or it becomes the dominant culture. It becomes the dominant culture or it becomes the ruling culture, so that the ruling class remains in power. So the ruling class will manipulate the society through culture, and the imposed ruling class worldview perception becomes the accepted cultural behavior. For instance, in a particular country like India, where we have diverse cultures, one particular culture is considered to be as the culture of the country. One particular dance form becomes the national dance form, or one particular form of music becomes the national form, and other forms of music, other forms of dances are left in the periphery. So this is cultural hegemony. So what happens is, the dominant ideology of the ruling class justifies the social, political, and economic status quo as natural. That is, the domination, the control is natural. It is inevitable. You cannot escape that. It is permanent. It is perpetual, and it is good for every social class. It is actually, in fact, beneficial for the ruling class, but it is portrayed as being beneficial to everybody. So this sort of control is called cultural hegemony. Now, what is the basic premise behind this? This is a quotation from Foucault. If you can control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. That is, you control his thinking. If you make a man feel that he is inferior, you do not have to compel him to accept his inferior status, because he will seek it himself. He will voluntarily surrender himself if he is convinced that he is inferior. If you make a person think that he is justly, that is rightly, an outcast, you do not have to order him to the back door. He will not come through the front door. He will always come through the back door, or he will go to it himself without being told. And if there is no back door, he will demand one. So when a person is culturally convinced, culturally made to feel he is inferior, then he is convinced that he is inferior and he will surrender himself. He himself would give up all his rights. He would say that he is inferior, and he would argue that he must be controlled for his own benefit. So this is the basic premise of cultural hegemony or cultural control. Now, how does this happen? This is called assimilation. That is losing one's cultural identity. This is called cultural assimilation. This can be voluntary or it can be enforced. Forced assimilation, and you can also have at times voluntary assimilation. That is when a group or when an individual accepts another group's or another person's attitudes or culture as his or her own. So their cultural identity, the self, is lost. And full assimilation occurs when new members of a society become indistinguishable from members of the other group. So they tend to dress like the other group, they tend to speak like them, or they tend to use their art forms, they take up their cuisine, everything they adopt, they give up their culture, their cultural practices, and they absorb, they internalize another culture, and thereby they lose their cultural identity. This is called cultural assimilation. Now, for example, this happened to the Australian Aborigines. The Aborigines, that is the children called the stolen generation, they were removed forcibly from the children. Aborigine children were forcibly removed by the white colonizers from their parents, and they were brought up in care homes or in boarding schools where they were not allowed to speak their Aborigine language. They were not allowed to eat their culturally followed food, nothing. They had to dress like the Europeans. They had to eat European food, they had to speak the European language, and gradually they lost their cultural identity. And even there were intermarriages, and even biologically, that particular race was assimilated into the white race. This happened to the Australian Aborigines, it happened to the Red Indian, whom we call Red Indians, the natives in America, and the natives in the Caribbean islands. So this is assimilation, loss of identity. Now, this cultural hegemony is a theory. Now, coming to practice, where is it practiced? It is practiced in patriarchy. That is the rule of the man. Male dominance. Male dominance is culturally sanctioned. They say that a woman must not defy a man, that a man is the head of the family. The man is the provider. Even if he is unemployed and he is a drunkard, he is supposed to be the head of the family. That fit for nothing is considered to be the head of the family. So they are culturally conditioned. And then it happened in Germany, Hitler's Nazism, in Italy, Mussolini's fascism, and very importantly, you have Eurocentrism. Eurocentrism is white man superiority. Anything that is white is good, anything that is black is evil. I am reminded of a conversation the famous black boxer Muhammad Ali had with his mother. He was born a Christian. He was called Cassius Clay, and then he found Christianity sanctioned racial discrimination, and he thought that he was convinced that Islam was without such sort of a discrimination, and then he became a Muslim. And he described a conversation he had with his mother. So when he was a child, Cassius Clay, that is Muhammad Ali, asked his mother, "Mother, why is that everything that is white is good? Why is that everything black is bad? Jesus is white. Mother Mary is white. Joseph is white. In the Last Supper, everyone is white. There are no blacks in the Last Supper." And he asked, "Are there no black angels in heaven? Anything that is bad, anything that is black is bad. A black cat brings bad luck. And if I threaten somebody, it is called blackmail. Why can't you say white mail? Why should that threatening be called blackmail? And the wrongly earned money is called black money. And if I sell something illegally, then it is a black market. Why is that?" he asked. The mother, of course, could not answer his questions. And today, in the United States, you have a movement, particularly after the killing of George Floyd, you have a movement that has gained momentum, Black Lives Matter. So that is a revolt against Eurocentrism or white superiority. And then colonization was justified by culture. Imperialism was justified by culture. Racism was justified. All hierarchical relationships, all master-slave relationships are justified through culture. They are perpetuated through culture. Influence. Almost entire post-structuralism is Gramsci based. Almost entire post-structuralism is post-Marxian, post-Gramsci. You can take Louis Althusser in France, Michel Foucault in France, Edward Said in America, Spivak from America, and Ellen Showalter, that famous feminist theorist. All these theorists and critics and philosophers were influenced by Gramsci. Now coming to Louis Althusser, he was a French post-structuralist. He was influenced by Gramsci and he rejected the traditional economic determinism, or what we earlier said, the base superstructure model, that is the economic or the means of production being the base and the superstructure, education, culture being the superstructure, and the means of production or economics controlling society, that is called economic determinism. He rejected that. He is famous for a concept called cultural interpolation, or we can, in ordinary terms, call what is a cultural shock. That is when we encounter a new culture, what happens to us? So how do we adapt ourselves to the new culture? How do we internalize it? Or why do we reject it? Althusser called it cultural interpolation. This is a process in which we encounter alien cultural values and internalize them, or sometimes we may also reject them. And Althusser is famous for RSA and ISA, that is repressive state apparatuses and ideological state apparatuses. Apparatuses, means of control, how the state controls people. Repressive state apparatus is direct violence through police, prison, judiciary. All these are repressive, which are visible forms of control. He called them repressive state apparatuses. And then he called another set of controlling tools ideological state apparatuses, that is controlling people ideologically, particularly through cultural institutions such as religion, tradition, education, family, sports, media, entertainment, forms of entertainment, all these. And these he calls them ideological state apparatuses. And he found that cultural control is more effective and enduring. Enduring is long-standing. And when people are culturally controlled, that is the subalterns, willingly accept their inferior status as natural and beneficial, like the Dalits who once upon a time, long back, not now, long back, the Dalits were convinced they were inferior and they accepted the superiority or the control of the upper caste in India, and the blacks accepting the superiority of the whites. So this is cultural control. Next is Michel Foucault. He is a French philosopher and historian of ideas, and his famous theory is the theory of discourse or the theory of text. He analyzed how knowledge is created and how knowledge is thrust on people and how some forms of knowledge are considered to be good. His famous book written in 1969, Archaeology of Knowledge, how knowledge is produced. Knowledge is produced to control. And next is a very important book written in 1975, Discipline and Punish, that is the birth of the prison. If possible, you try to read this book. He talks about how the prison came to be considered as an important institution in society. Earlier, it was the imprisonment of the body. Today, it is the imprisonment of the mind. The punishment has moved over from the body to the mind. So a person is psychologically imprisoned, he is isolated, or solitary confinement. All these are imprisonment of the mind. And then history of sexuality. His theory is very, very important. Power is not possessed. That is, possessed is not static, inert. Power is a dynamic. It is something that is exercised, usually through culture ideologically. And knowledge is power. Not in the ordinary sense that we use in the everyday life. Actually, he meant knowledge is political power. Next is Edward Said, the American critic who began that discipline called post-colonialism. His famous book, Orientalism, and of course, Culture and Imperialism. Edward Said talked about the relationship between culture, knowledge, and power. How knowledge is always aligned with power. How culture is always aligned with power. And he talked about an attitude called textual attitude. Textual attitude simply means the authority of a text. Anything that is written becomes a text, and anything that is put to writing gains authority. Then somebody says, who said it? Then you say, somebody has written it in a book. This is said in such and such a book. So the text gaining authority, and we think that a text is true. Anything that a text says is true. That is called textual attitude. Next is contrapuntal reading. Contrapuntal reading is reading against or contrary to the accepted way of reading. When everybody reads it in one way, we may read it in a different way. Everybody reads Othello in a different way, in a particular way. A black would read Othello in a different way. A Dalit would read certain parts of the Bible or even the Bhagavad Gita in a different way. So reading a text which is contrary to the accepted way of reading is called contrapuntal reading. Contrapuntal reading is actually against a cultural representation or cultural control. So the next important concept is, now we are coming, how can we apply cultural studies in our academics, in our curriculum, or for research? How can it be applied? What is the scope for cultural studies in research today? Now, Gramsci himself developed a concept called counterculture or counter-hegemony. There is a lot of scope for research using this concept. That is, you define the way people develop ideas and discourses that challenge the usual ways of interpreting a text. You can counter-read a text. Any text can be counter-read, and that becomes a counter discourse, or it offers counterculture. Many writers have been using this concept. In Africa, you find two women writers, Chimamanda Adichie and Buchi Emejeta. These two writers can be considered as important creative writers who are writing counter discourses against the dominant discourses. Then you have the Australian Aborigine writings. You have a lot of Australian dramatists and novelists who are writing about the colonial experience as they saw it, and not as the whites portrayed it to the outside world. So this is counterculture or counter discourse. And then you have a lot of resistance movements. You have the negritude movement. The negritude movement began after the Second World War in France. A set of African intellectuals who were living in France started this movement as a counter to Eurocentrism. They coined that famous phrase, "Black is beautiful." So a lot of resistant movements were influenced by Gramsci's concept of counterculture or counter-hegemony. And then you had the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem Renaissance, you have very important writers like Alice Walker, the poet Langston Hughes. The Harlem Renaissance, that is the Black writers who lived in Harlem neighborhood suburb of New York, the Harlem Renaissance, which celebrated the blackness in America. And even today, you have the Black American movement, that is the Black Lives Matter movement. So these are some areas we can consider for research, particularly these African women writers and Australian Aborigine writers. We can apply Gramsci's concept of hegemony, Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony, and also Foucault's concept of discourse, or Althusser's concept of ideological control. All these, of course, they are all related to one another, each other. We can use these concepts to read literature, particularly emerging new writings. So before we close, I would suggest a few books that can make a good beginning reading. You have Gramsci's Prison Notebooks, translated from Italian. Of course, they run to several volumes, but there is a very handy book, Selections from Prison Notebooks. That's a title, Selections from Prison Notebooks, which contains the key writings of Gramsci. And of course, Raymond Williams' book, Culture and Society. Culture and Society makes an easy read, not a very tough book. Althusser's Ideology and Ideological State Apparatus is also an easy book. And Stuart Hall also. Similarly, Thionga, you must be very familiar with Decolonizing the Mind. These are very important books for understanding cultural studies. And Foucault is a tough writer. His Archaeology of Knowledge is tough reading. Maybe those who want to go further can read Foucault. And of course, Edward Said's Culture and Imperialism. So these books will give us a good grasp over cultural studies, and also a good theoretical background which can help us in our academics, in our research. Thank you. If you have any questions, you can please post them. So there is one particular question. What is the difference between ideological state apparatuses and alteral hegemony? Alteral hegemony is only an alternate hegemony, which can substitute one hegemony. Ideological hegemony, already I told you, through culture, controlling people through culture, that is one. Second, if all sorts of immortal activities such as imperialism, racism, and so on are justified in the name of culture, then what is the value of culture? This is a very, very important question. Usually we have to go back to T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot said that you have an elite culture, which is always good. Macdonald said the role of culture is to identify and tell us the best that is known in the world. So usually we tend to associate culture with everything positive. But Gramsci, Stuart Hall, and Raymond Williams have a different view. They said there is nothing good or bad about culture. Culture is only a way of living, and let us not be very, very sanctimonious about culture. There is nothing sacred about it. It is ordinary living. And so racism, imperialism are all politics, and they use culture negatively to control people. Is there any connection between cultural studies, post-structuralism, and comparative studies. Okay, we'll come to comparative studies at the end of it. Now, cultural studies is only an offshoot of post-structuralism. You know structuralism. Structuralism says that everything has a meaning only in a context. And post-structuralism was an extension. Some say it is against structuralism. Some people say post-structuralism is only an extension of structuralism. I look at it only as an extension of structuralism. Post-structuralism does not reject structuralism. It only says it is inadequate. Okay. Cultural studies is a part of post-structuralism. Althusser, more importantly, Michel Foucault is considered to be a post-structuralist theorist. On the one side, he comes under cultural studies, and like feminism or post-colonialism, postmodernism or reader response theory, all these coming under post-structuralism, cultural studies also can be considered as structuralism. And comparative studies, we must not compare, we tend to confuse it with comparative literature. In parallel, but the problem here is we may tend to look at one culture as superior and another culture as inferior. It is not so. We are only comparing. The next question. Excuse me. Counterculture works. Whether that's a very important question. Counterculture works. Counterculture does work. Counterculture has worked. Counterculture has worked in the case of the blacks. It has worked in the case of Dalit writings. It has its value amongst Australian Aborigine writers. So counterculture does work. It is not only a mere academic exercise, it also has a lot of political power. Even Frantz Fanon is critical about negritude. Of course, Frantz Fanon was critical about negritude because that is I don't know whether I can do justice to the entire Frantz Fanon here. Frantz Fanon rejected negritude because it was inadequate. That is one. Negritude argued that there was something called a black soul. But Fanon said the concept of a black soul and the concept of a single black soul is again something like the argument of saying there is a white soul. So he says negritude movement is using the arguments of Eurocentrism. And moreover, he said negritude was confined itself to an artistic movement. Of course, it helped political issues, but he said it was inadequate for the liberation of the blacks. As a political theory, he said negritude was inadequate. We can't say that he rejected. He said it was inadequate. Is there any book based on racial hegemony on Jews? Are you, I don't know whether you're asking the racial prejudice practiced by the Jews or on the Jews. There are a lot of books written by, for example, there's a book written by Julien Benda, a French philosopher. He has written a book. He found the Jews were let down by European intellectuals, and they in a way helped Hitler's massacring of the Jews. He wrote a book, Julien Benda wrote a book about the Jews, the racial discrimination practice against the Jews. The book is titled Betrayal of the Intellectuals, a book by Julien Benda. And of course, the Jews, that is Israel, not all Jews, but you have a dominant right-wing group among the Jews in Israel. They practice today racial discriminatory politics, the occupation of the West Bank. Of course, Edward Said himself has written a lot about this discrimination or the domination of the Jews over the Palestinians. That can be a good book. As cultural studies cultural studies just bring out cultural heritage of particular society, or it also helps in pointing out few ideological practices within a culture. Cultural studies does not analyze any culture. Cultural studies is not study about culture, cultural practices. That I think are folkloristics. They talk about they study cultural practices. Cultural studies actually talks about how culture is used as a tool of control. That is how cultural studies look at culture. Cultural studies is not a study of cultures. It is a study of how culture is a political tool. You have any other questions? Okay, thank you, participants. I do not know how much time I have taken. The time was very brief. It's a very complex topic. We have tried to do something. We have tried to indicate certain areas of research and certain areas for further study. We hope that you found the session useful. You have a feedback form, and we request you to fill up. And we thank all of you for participating in this webinar. Thank you.
Sir, we wholeheartedly thank you for this wonderful session with your mind-blowing thoughts and the way you inspired us. Thanks a ton, sir. Finally, I would like to call upon Professor Jeniston to propose the vote of thanks on behalf of the college fraternity. Over to you, sir.
I feel happy to propose the vote of thanks on behalf of the department on this memorable occasion. We are grateful to our secretary, Father Amala Jayarayan, for his able guidance who has always encouraged us. I thank our principal, Dr. Spies Monsieur, our well-wisher, for his support, vision, and commitment. I extend my gratitude to Father Divya Alexander, Dean, for his graceful guidance. I'm happy to express my heartfelt thanks to today's resource person, Dr. J. Raghu Antony, for his wonderful presentation. I extend my special thanks to all my colleagues, Professor Sangeeta, Professor Abhinaya, and Professor Mahendran, for their seamless support. I'm happy to extend my special thanks to all the faculties, research scholars, and student participants who have made this seminar a grand success. I express our profound gratitude to our management for their great support and offering us the paid version of Zoom. Once again, I thank you all for making this day grand success.
Thank you, sir. A gentle reminder, we are conducting an e-quiz titled Postmodernism and After that starts tomorrow. We will share the link in our Telegram group. Kindly do participate and check the power of your knowledge. Please be patient enough to receive your certificates. Thank you all for your active participation. Please do fill the feedback form so that we can give you certificates. Have a great day ahead. Stay home, stay safe. Ma'am? Abhinaya, ma'am?
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Shall we end the session?
Yes, we can.
Yes, thank you.